After the national conventions, the campaigning for the presidency begins. On Tuesday, November the 8th, 2016, voters will go to the polls to vote for the President of the United States and other state, county, and local candidates, and also on issues. The results of the popular vote on the election day will set the stage for the last step in the process, the Electoral College. First, let's look at the national election day. So, Terry, let's talk about what the Constitution says about when we have this election and what's it mean?
You know, Congress sets the date of the election as the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And that's a very old tradition about when people could come for market day and those kinds of things. And certainly in other Western democracies, such as in Europe, their election day is either a national holiday or it's on the weekend. And so we're very different, even though we were the first we're the first modern democracy, we certainly do it differently from all other democracies in the world.
That's it. And of course, the other part of the Constitution says there is no federal election where it's governed from the federal level. It's up to the 50 states and the District of Columbia to have their own laws for conducting an election. And how does that affect the process?
Well, Article 1, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution does just that. It says that that states can do whatever they want when it comes to elections unless there's a national law, such as Election Day is set at the national level. But in terms of how many hours your polls are open, the national standard is 12 as a minimum, but some states are open for 15 hours or more on Election Day. Some states have early voting, some states don't, but all states do have absentee voting and provisional voting if needed.
And of course, as we know, Aubrey, we get caught up in that the East Coast closes first, the West Coast is still voting, and how does that affect the election?
Well, and interestingly, what the media has started doing is not projecting winners until all the polls have closed in a particular state, because they were catching a lot of flack for estimating who, based on exit polls, they thought was going to win while polls were still open. For instance, in 2000 in Florida, when we had our somewhat of a fiasco of an election, a little after 7 p.m. Eastern, they all announced that Al Gore had won Florida. And of course, because we have two time zones out, in Pensacola, for instance, people were still voting. So that's one of the major changes. I guess one of the other changes, one of the other differences you see between states is an interesting fact. When you get to states like Hawaii, they have one of the lowest voter turnouts in presidential races because they're so many hours farther away than the mainland that in almost all elections, except for the very closest ones, they already know who's going to be president, and so a lot of them don't bother to show up.
That's it. Yeah. So what would be some suggestions you would have for change?
Well, it's interesting because sort of where that came from with the media sort of holding back. Before the media held back, I remember in 1980 when President Jimmy Carter, he conceded the race to Ronald Reagan when 8%, single-digit 8%, had actually been voted and been counted. And so there's been sort of a gentleman's agreement between the candidates saying, well, we're not going to concede or declare victory until the polls close, at least in California, those poor Hawaiians. But I think that the issue is really if people take advantage of early voting and absentee voting, then they voted no matter what happens on Election Day.
All right, well, let's get the key point in. When you vote on Election Day, you're not truly electing the president, you're voting for something called the elector, and that's what's on the ballot for your selection for elector, and then it has the presidential name. So, Aubrey, what is an elector, and how did they get to that role?
Sure. Well, the electors are basically people who are pledged to vote for the president in what's known as the Electoral College. And so each state has a certain number of electors based on how many congressional seats they have, plus, of course, every state has 2 senators. So currently, Florida has 29 electoral votes. Each political party in the state, the executive committee of the party, gets to pick who will be the electors for their party. And so, for instance, the Republican Party of Florida and the Democratic Party of Florida, they both will pick 29 people who will represent their parties. and then whichever candidate actually wins the state. So for instance, if the Democratic candidate wins the state, the Democratic electors actually get to go to Tallahassee and officially cast their ballots for the Democratic nominee. And that's the way in general, that's the way it works.
All right,
Except for 2 states.
Right. And we're going to talk about the timeline on the Electoral College in a minute, but let's talk about the one thing everybody always questions, the amount of money that goes into a presidential campaign. How has money changed that presidential election?
Well, certainly each year or each 4-year cycle, we seem to set a new record in the amount of money spent. And I think there's 2 or 3 different changes that we have seen over time. One, we do actually have a system of optional public campaign financing for the general election for president. But presidents have to, both candidates, or at least one of the candidates has to be willing to do it. And so when Barack Obama ran against John McCain, McCain said, I will take the public campaign financing, but Barack Obama did not. And Barack Obama was able to raise about 10 times the amount of money that John McCain had to spend. So this last time around, both Barack Obama and Mitt Romney both said, no, we're not going to take the public money. We're going to raise as much as we can on our own. Probably the other major thing that has changed is traditionally most of the money was given to the candidates and the political parties, and that's where we saw most of the money coming from and being spent. But nowadays, you have these outside groups that have these sort of fancy names, 527s and super PACs and all these other things, but they basically can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money. And so they have become much more important in influencing how people vote for president.
And they all translate to commercials, and everybody gets mad at the commercials.
Right, and mostly
Yes.
negative commercials too,
Exactly.
because the
Yeah.
candidates don't want to run the negative ones, so they let these outside groups
Yeah.
do that.
I want to thank both of you for your insight on the national conventions and why we hold a national convention and how they've changed. And next, we're going to take a look at what the popular vote means in the process. We'll be right back.